A luxury car drives on a mountain road inside which are a couple, a young beauty in a wedding dress and an older man. In front of them is a house located in a beautiful location with mountains, trees and a blue sky. They are greeted by Claire, the housekeeper, and by a young man whom the owner calls Oliver. Elizabeth is enchanted by the beauty of the house, the huge windows, the warmth and comfort at the final entrance.
She sees beautiful flowers and realizes that winter is blind. In the evening, dinner is set on a table with varied dishes and a night of love. The next morning, the husband shows his young wife around the house, pointing out expensive paintings and valuable art objects. A luxurious wardrobe, a wonderful kitchen, and spacious bedrooms await her, with biometric locks on all doors. Elizabeth sees a frosted door and asks Henry what's behind it. Her husband tells her that this is a place she must not enter. The girl explains that she couldn't even if she wanted to because there are locks everywhere. Henry explains that all biometric scanners are set to the settings of 2 people, 2 of them. The next morning, Henry leaves. Elizabeth is sad because it is their honeymoon. She swims in the pool and walks around the house. Elizabeth asks Claire about her work. The shy maid questions why an important scholar like Henry married an ordinary girl like her, but the woman doesn't answer. Elizabeth spends the day reading, trying on clothes and jewelry, and dancing in front of the mirror. At night, insomnia drives her to leave her room and explore the house, unknowingly entering the forbidden room. Curiosity trumps common sense and Elizabeth enters. Behind the door is a room that looks like a laboratory. Elizabeth presses a button on a panel and suddenly a door opens, revealing a glass capsule containing the body of a young woman with a tube in her mouth. She seems to be sleeping. Terrified, Elizabeth runs away, overturning a table and cutting her finger on the glass. In the morning, Henri arrives. He plays the piano for Elizabeth.
But quickly notices her distracted thoughts. He sees the finger tighten and asks her what happened. Elizabeth justifies herself, claiming that she is clumsy. Henry replies calmly, so much is Elizabeth hurt and he easily discovered her deception. At night, Elizabeth pretends to sleep. She hears Henri heading towards the forbidden room and stealthily follows him. Suddenly, Henry emerges from the darkness.
He accused Elizabeth of disobedience. Frightened, Elizabeth tries to escape, but all the doors are closed. Henri catches up with her on the stairs, grabs her leg and throws her to the ground. He then hits her with a metal poker. In the next scene, Claire and Oliver dig a grave on the lawn and lay Elizabeth's body there. After the funeral, they sit at the table. Claire asks if everything is over, but Henri replies that it is not.
6 weeks later, Henry brings in a double of Elizabeth. Same conversations, same actions. Once again, Henry asks her not to enter the forbidden room. Elizabeth promises to follow the rules. He loves each other again while Claire watches them in the shadows. At night, Elizabeth cannot sleep. She wanders into the house and finds Claire sitting in the kitchen. Elizabeth starts asking Claire questions, her curiosity growing. Claire tries to warn her of something, but Henry enters and takes his wife back. The next morning, Henry asks Elizabeth to be a good girl before leaving. She wanders around the house, calling for Claire and Oliver but getting no response. Bored, she tries on dresses and jewelry, swims in the pool at night, and plays the piano.
The forbidden room becomes a magnet and Elizabeth enters it and then screams and runs away. Meanwhile, Henry arrives and notices that his wife is frightened. Elizabeth rushes into the bathroom, but Henry realizes that she has disobeyed him. In the kitchen, Elizabeth arms herself with a knife while Henri takes a tampon soaked in the earth. He sits down at the piano and starts playing. Elizabeth relaxes by hearing the music, but it's a trap.
A record is played as Henry sneaks in from behind, grabs Elizabeth and presses the pillow against her face. She seems to have lost consciousness, but in a last gesture, Elizabeth sticks a knife in her. The couple collapsed in a pool of blood. Elizabeth regains consciousness, but Henry is dead. She wipes the blood off the floor and tidies up the kitchen. She wraps Henry's body in a rug, loads him into the elevator and cleans herself. She discards the wedding ring and burns the blood-stained clothes. When she sees Claire and Oliver, she pretends everything is fine. The couple is shocked to see Elizabeth alive and unharmed. She declares that Henry is resting upstairs. Claire goes to the kitchen and suddenly collapses from a heart attack. Elizabeth calls for help, and the ambulance takes Claire away as Elizabeth tries to leave.
But Oliver tells her he won't be able to protect her if she walks through the door. She realizes that Henry is dead. Scared, Elizabeth tries to explain that it was self-defense. Oliver reassures her that he hated Henry too, and that he will help her get rid of the body. The young man asks her what she remembers from her childhood. She replies that she stayed in the hospital for a long time after her parents died in a car accident and that she grew up in an orphanage. Elizabeth asks her who she is. Oliver reveals that she is one of Henry's wife's cyclones, number 5. The girl is in shock and feels a real panic. Oliver advises Elizabeth to run away as soon as possible. She can take the money from the safe. The girl goes to her room to pack her bags. Oliver enters Claire's diary in his hand. As she tries to decipher the writing, Oliver closes the doors. Elizabeth doesn't understand what's going on. She asks to go out, but Oliver is adamant. Desperate, Elizabeth opens Claire's diary. She discovers that Claire has received an invitation from Henri to work with him because she is a prominent geneticist. When she arrived at the scientist's house, she met Oliver, but when she heard what he was going to do, she was surprised to find herself in the middle of a tragic, inexplicable, unpleasant and impossible love story. Henri revealed that his wife died shortly after giving birth to Oliver from a very rare disease. His genes had suddenly and severely degenerated. Her grief-stricken husband cloned his wife's cells and created 6 copies, but the disease manifested itself in the latter as well. To save time, Henri builds cryogenic chambers and places the bodies in stasis. When Claire joins the project, there are only 4 left.
He gets to work and decodes the gene for the disease. Meanwhile, Henri records messages and plays music for the clones. He hopes to build their memory. However, the last, Elizabeth, remembers nothing beyond a few seconds, suffering from not having a true inner world. The constant tension of her consciousness had become too strong for her body. One day, she walked into the lab and ran away, horrified.
Elizabeth closes her diary when winter sets in. He brings her dinner and asks her to behave. But Elizabeth attacks him and asks him for the code to the door. The girl goes to the laboratory where she sees Oliver working on the body of the last Elizabeth, number 6. He asks her to support the clone's head. While the 5th copy supports the clone's head, Oliver injects it with a sedative. She wakes up in a room, chained to bed. Unable to escape, she opens Claire's diary again. She recalls their continued search, but the clone died shortly after. Claire realized the neurodegeneration had returned and couldn't bear it. Henry, desperate, acted like a madman, but Claire reminded him he was acting like a lover, and a bond formed between them.
Oliver enters the room again and wants to know what Claire wrote about him. Elizabeth explains that Claire began a relationship with Henry after the death of the 3rd clone. The woman didn't know that Henri had altered the samples, which means Claire wasn't wrong. She managed to stop the disease and the remaining clones are healthy. Oliver says that as a child he admired Elizabeth because she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen.
One day, Oliver saw Henry kissing the girl. That night, the man made Oliver blind. After having told everything, Oliver by Elizabeth continues to read. Claire writes that she ended the relationship alone because it was impossible to compete with Elizabeth. In addition, Henry talks about his grief at having lost his beloved and his dream of reliving that wedding night. Claire found no record of Elizabeth's birth, and realized that Oliver was not Henry's son. Henry himself was young. She had created it because she feared that Elizabeth would not want her current appearance. In the morning, Elizabeth wakes up feeling scissors on her neck. Oliver asks him to tell him what Claire wrote about him. In her diary, Elizabeth admits that Claire thought he was a clone of Henry.
But that's not true. Henry showed a birth certificate that Oliver is not Henry. Elizabeth asks him if he loves her and invites her to touch her. She takes off her pants and invites him to come closer. Oliver can't resist the temptation and approaches. He kisses Elizabeth, but the girl throws him to the ground and strangles him with the chain. She must give him the keys to the chains and reveal the true code of the door. At that moment, another Elizabeth enters the room. Pointing a gun, the girls look identical. Oliver tries to convince the new Elizabeth that the one in the room is sick, that she is an imposter and their enemy. The fifth Elizabeth claims that it is not true, that they are hostages and that she just wants to leave. Obeying Oliver, the sixth Elizabeth orders the other to lie down on the ground, but the fifth Elizabeth protects Oliver when the sixth Elizabeth finally fires. The bullet kills our Winter and injures the fifth clone. The latter tries to escape while the sixth clone cries. In the Winter, Elizabeth, wounded, comes out of the house. A gunshot rang out. The last Elizabeth killed the fifth clone. Morning arrives, the last clone reads Claire's diary. Henry transferred all his possessions to Claire so she could continue her research. The man insists he never wanted to kill the one he tried to resurrect, it just happened. His versions aren't his own. Elizabeth only feels them real by destroying them. Henri is willing to do anything to put an end to this. Elizabeth finishes reading and sees a taxi stop at the house. Claire gets out and finds herself at the door. Elizabeth leaves everything to Claire as she deserves it and walks away, leaving behind the terrifying and incomprehensible.